So John, we're in your studio at the moment. Tell us about the painting behind you and how that came about.
Well, it all began almost 2 years ago. I think the thing about growing up, witnessing my father as an artist, was really seeing the side of him that it didn't come easily to him. He wasn't really famous when I was a child, although he was quite a gregarious character and was quite what they would call the darling of Sydney at that time. But someone once said to me, what's it like having a famous father like John? I said, well, you get past Newtown, hardly anyone's heard of him. As a young artist, his 30s, and me being a little boy, it was his studio discipline that was the thing that I really noticed about him, and the way that he embraced poetry and literature, and that a lot of his friends were writers like Patrick White and James Macaulay, the poet, Xavier Herbert, who wrote Poor Fellow My Country. And so his intellectual life mirrored his artistic life as such, and that in itself was part of the nourishment of his ideas. And I think he really learnt that from having lived in Mallorca with Robert Graves, the great writer, historian and poet, that these things go hand in hand. For a while we lived in Europe. Dad had tapestry commissions, and we lived in the south of Andalusia, in the south of Spain. Then we lived in Portugal. And he became a Mediterranean man in lots of ways. An Australian man trapped in a Mediterranean psyche. The idea of simplicity, the village, the common touch, to be able to have a sense of that ordinary people had great wisdom, which is a lovely European quality. And in that, we lived in Watson's Bay, which then was really a fishing village. And out of that came the Opera House mural, and how he adapted Kenneth Slessor's poetry of a man drowning in Sydney Harbour to what is now a timeless, what some would say his Picasso's Guernica, based on a mythology about Sydney Harbour becoming like a Greek tragedy. And how that now is a timeless painting that can never be removed. But having done the harbour, he then was invited on trips with the ABC up to Kakadu and then out to Lake Eyre. And then the landscape became his great enigma. And he could never understand how, whenever we travel and people ask us, where's the heart of Australia? They talked about the desert. And that's not where most of us lived. Our First Nation people lived there, but really the rest of Australians, particularly European Australians, are saucer dwellers living on the edge. But still, when we talked about where is the soul of our country, it wasn't even Bondi Beach. It was like the heart, the desert. And so that really intrigued him, that in the emptiness of Australia was its fullness. He never recovered from the landscape. He painted the landscape until the very last day. He was very drawn by in First Nations art, how they, even without helicopters, their works were really like they symbolised maps. Their topographical landscapes of the imagination, the dreamtime, which is really about looking where the universe collides with the Earth. The stars and the galaxies become one totality of the dreaming. It totally fascinated him, and hence why a lot of his work became topographic. Because he even though he was great friends with Fred Williams, he said, I think Fred's aesthetic and the capacity to nail the aesthetic of the Australian landscape. He knew its colours, he knew its tones, but the horizon could only tell you so much. It was getting above the landscape that you really get a sense that, in a sensual way, he saw rivers being like umbilical cords. It's where the motherness of the Australian landscape, the Mother Earth, really could be felt. So really that's the theme that's sort of right up until the day he died. We were down at the farm, and he'd been working on 4 paintings, large paintings, for some time. And he spent the morning working on these 4 paintings. And he signed them. He never normally used to sign things really till I was about to get on the truck. But he signed them these days, and he walked past the kitchen to his bedroom at the farm. And my sister and I were there cooking lunch. And he said, I think I'm going to have a little lie down. And he passed away. It was beautiful, it was poetic. And so he finished his last landscapes as really his way of signing off to nature, to earth, and to everything he loved. So it was a lovely fitting end. One of John's most well-known quotes is, I'm in the landscape and the landscape's in me. I think Neil Balnave's gift is something that young artists can always look at and know that there's nothing wrong with the idea of being provincial to be great. Young artists want to be international, they want to be superstars, they want to be like famous actors. But really the greatest actors were really people that just nailed Shakespeare and worked in theatre, not big screens. I think Balnaves knew that being a media man as well, knew that great things come out of really just loving your environment, and that and to work selflessly. That I'm not here trying to create the Mona Lisa. I'm here just looking at a landscape. I'm looking at the harbour, and I'm seeing these romantic things, as though that perhaps I could be in Venice, looking at steamboats going up and down the canal. Streeton captured that sense of Sydney's harbour's power and poetry. And if there's ever been a time where art students need to be brought back to earth, it's by looking at paintings like that. I remember asking Lloyd Rees once, when he was in his early 90s, I said, we've seen First Nation art, we've seen Heidelberg's, we've seen abstract expressionism being applied to landscape in the way perhaps my father worked. And we've seen the minimalism of Fred Williams. And with your work, we're seeing a beautiful sense of how really Australia is connected to the whole world in the way that we can look at it as being similar to other parts of, say, Europe or whatever. But where do you see landscape going next? And he looked at me through his grey eyes and his worn straw hat. And he looked at me thoughtfully. He said, Tim, I really don't have an answer for that, because all of us live in the midst of our endlessness. And that really made me feel such an open-ended answer, that there was a man who was facing his mortality. But what he was really saying is that people will always come up with new ways of looking at things. And when you look at the street and you look at the Olsen, there you have it. New ways of looking at things, but sticking true to the subject. Not only was Streeton and Olsen, mavericks in a sense of being people out of the norm within their society, but in every sense, they are also explorers.
So it's this kind of thing that whilst one perhaps would overemphasize individuality and self-expression, that art has its own dialogue, and therefore I consider that tradition is a very important thing. It's a wonderful big stew, and you take what you like.
John Olsen, thank you very much.
There you are.